All right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Hello.
Good evening.
Take two. All right. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
If you could all place your microphones on mute so we don't get any weird feedback during the program. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm likely not a familiar face here yet, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Alex Solomon, the new Communications and Outreach Coordinator at Santa Lucia Conservancy. I started in May and came down from Portland, where I worked for a salmon and steelhead conservation nonprofit. I earned a bachelor's degree from Lewis and Clark College in environmental studies and pre-law. My goals in this newly created position are to host interactive and educational events such as this one, increase our online presence, build partnerships with like-minded organizations, and design materials for preserve members to dive deeper into what it means to live in a conservation community. Now I'd like to introduce our honored guest and host of this Ecology Talk, Lynn Schofield. Lynn Schofield is a biologist for the Institute for Bird Populations. Her research covers a diversity of topics, including bird migration, forest fire ecology, and wetland conservation. In addition to using her research to help inform effective conservation strategies, Lynn also helps to make connections with nature accessible to all. She is one of the core members of the Cal Falcons social media project and a longtime volunteer for the Golden Gate Raptor Observatory. Today, she'll be sharing her research on how spotted owls choose habitat after wildfire, using the 2013 Rimfire in Yosemite as a case study. We're incredibly excited to welcome Lynn and learn more about her work with this elusive species that hides so well on the preserve. Without further ado, please take it away, Lynn.
Oh, thank you for the introduction, and I'm pleased to be talking with you guys. It's a topic I really like. I'm going to be talking broadly about fire kind of to start with. And then I'm going to consider a study, an example species that's actually really known for being associated with fire. And then we're going to look at specifically the spotted owl, which you might not expect to have a relationship with fire. But of course, in California, everything has some relationship with fire at this point. So, without further ado, I'll switch over to my talk here and let me get this started at the beginning for you guys. Is the screen share working and everyone is seeing what I'm seeing in a cute woodpecker here?
Yep.
All right, wonderful. So I'm kind of gonna, broadly talk about wildlife and wildfires before I get on to the spotted owls in specific. And I want to make clear that what I'm talking about is a lot of original research done by not just myself, but also colleagues of mine at the Institute for Bird Populations where I work, but also the U.S. Forest Service collaborators have worked on this, and people at UCLA and the Yosemite National Park, of course. That's where a lot of the work was focused. So I'm talking about a lot of research that I'm involved with, but of course, a lot of people are involved with this work. So I don't want to pretend like this is all me alone working on these things. And to start, as just kind of to acknowledge when we talk about wildlife and wildfire, the relationship that wildlife and wildfire has is complex, sometimes good and sometimes bad, but I also want to, address that there's also the human relationship with wildlife and wildfire that I'm not talking as much about, but is a different dynamic. And whatever I say, that's kind of in favor of wildfire, I am not minimizing the, the costs on people for these wildfires. It's a complicated story. And so I just kind of wanted to, show this picture. This was the campfire that was in Butte County several years ago, and it was the deadliest and continues to be in wildfire in California's history. But like kind of this fraught relationship with wildfire, although we're seeing a lot more wildfires, is not new. There ended up becoming a really hard push to prevent wildfires after what was referred to as the Big Blowup in 1910, when 3 million acres were burning across the greater Western US, focused largely in the Idaho chimney. And so this is an image from the US Forest Service that was taken in Idaho during 1910 in this big blowup. So you can see this is a pretty devastating wildfire. It's worth noting, though, the Dixie Fire going on right now, that's clocking in at 1 million acres burned on its own. So the dynamic is changing. These, huge fires were happening, decades ago, 100 years ago, but it's gotten bigger and different. But anyway, so in response to this 1910 big blow up, Smokey the Bear kind of came into vogue, and this led to a philosophy of all forest fire is bad all the time, and a management policy that was essentially to fight every fire no matter what and not let forest burn, kind of at all costs. But that's not a practical strategy. In the end, it's impossible to prevent fires forever in ecosystems like California. Slowly, dead wood builds up, slowly trees get older, and it is a natural part of the landscape. So this map here is pretty interesting. This is a map of how frequently wildfires would burn in any given region of the United States prior to colonial settlement. So as you can see, the dark red, that's anywhere between 1 and 5 years between fires, and dark green is where you hit the 1,000 years between fires sort of level. But you can see much of the United States was burning every 20 or fewer years. California on average was burning once every 11 to 15 years. And this is kind of a mix of things. For one, it's partially just how a lot of the plants and animals adapted. California has always been a relatively dry state with this kind of monsoonal season where it really doesn't rain in the summers. But it's also because of the management that was undertaken by the Native Americans in these regions. They actually helped assure that there were fires happening relatively regularly to encourage new growth, to help maintain trees, to prevent downed wood. And so yeah, that kind of relationship created what this fire map we see is here. And there's kind of this inaccurate perception that I've heard a lot of times that, wildfires, that's unique to the US, and it has to do with the US's management strategies or whatever. But the thing is, wildfires are part of ecosystems worldwide, and all kinds of ecosystems. So on the left there, that's me posing next to a Smokey the Bear sign, doing my thing, researching wildfires. That's what I do. And on the right is another place that I have also done research that is in Yucatan, Mexico, in the tropical scrub forest. And although that looks beautifully verdant and green right there, it's still actually quite a fire risk in that region. So different habitats, they have different climates and different relationships, but there still is fire as part of the ecosystem in many, many places. And in a healthy ecosystem, wildfire burns regularly in a mosaic that creates a diverse ecosystem with many kinds of types of plants and different age classes of plants. And so this picture here is from Yosemite National Park, and this is a really good example of kind of a mosaic of burn. You can see On the right hand of the picture, there's some areas where really the entire, all of the larger trees were burned, the canopy was burned through, but then as you see towards the left side of the picture, several trees did survive, these larger trees, and far in the background, you can see there's lots of trees where there was little damage to the forest and the trees at all. And so that's typically the dynamic you'd see historically, that when fires did burn, they were kind of in mixed severities, mixed sizes, and it creates a whole mosaic ecosystem. And mosaic ecosystems are really important because we imagine nature to be like the old growth forests and, beautiful and pristine and untouched. But the fact is that wildlife needs both old growth and new growth. On the left, we have the grasshopper sparrow, and they're a grassland bird. They like things that have grown within, the first year. And so this is an East Coast example. This isn't an ecosystem we find in California, but I just thought this was a lovely illustration that I borrowed. But yeah, so there's the grasshopper sparrow. They need short grass that's been recently burned or disturbed, but then you get over to the black and white warbler, and they glean insects off of large trees, and they're associated with old growth forest, trees that are 100 or more years old. And then all these other birds take habitats in between. And the thing is, we're not drawing a value judgment between what's more important, the grasshopper sparrow or the black and white warbler. Both of these birds are important. They're part of the ecosystem. And so, these mosaic burns, they're neat because even in areas that are being burned, many trees can survive a moderate fire, and that makes space for new growth. And so you get this whole mix. You have places where the overstory remains and you get new growth underneath, or places where the overstory is gone and you get a totally, fresh set of forbs and wildflowers. This here in the background, that's 1 year after the Rimfire, where you can see the canopy was gone, but it ends up being kind of a fertile area back there. But on the other hand, this is a paradox. So, there's a lot of things that are beneficial in the ecosystem. It creates this mosaic of all sorts of different habitat types. But of course, it's also devastating to, a lot of the individual animals that live in these locations. Bears are kind of notable in how vulnerable they often are to forest fires, because they will often respond to stressful situations by climbing trees, which is not a winning strategy when it comes to forest fires. And so that's partially why Smokey the Bear ended up kind of the mascot for the Forest Service and fire prevention, because a bear, there on the right, that is the original Smokey the Bear that was injured in a wildfire and, gained prominence as that mascot. So fire can be devastating to individuals, but it creates these opportunities for the future as habitat regenerates. And so these two pictures were taken within 5 minutes of each other on my camera while I was doing some work this is Ackerson Meadow in Yosemite National Park. And so you can see that on the one side, that is a stump that had burned completely, a tree that was totally lost. But on the other side, the loss of these trees created this super flush new growth that bear right there is loving. The bears were very much thriving in that area after the fire. And it creates all these opportunities for regeneration and regrowth. So these two pictures, taken in the same place, 2 years apart. That's a big change from what you immediately see after the fire and the devastation, and then what you see through time. And then just many organisms in California not only live with fire, but totally rely on fire. And here's just a couple examples. Sequoias. I think this fact is sort of a commonly shared fun fact, but the sequoia cones actually need to be exposed to some amount of heat before they'll open up and release their seeds. And that's because in a sequoia grove, there is not a lot of light for a young sequoia to be taking advantage of unless there's some sort of disturbance. And the disturbance they're most likely to encounter in the range of a sequoia is fire. And then morels, if anyone's a mushroom picker here, that's where you go to look for morels in California, is in places that have recently burned. And then there's the Blackbacked Woodpecker, who I'm going to talk about more. That's going to be our first little animal to focus on as the example of a bird associated with fire that will be our counterpoint to spotted owls. So, you know, pretty much I think to boil down this first little bit of the talk is not all wildfires are the same. You know, the one hand here to the left, you have a fire that has left behind some of the forest, that's opened up grassland, that's really made a mix of habitats. And on the right is the King Fire, which I did an extensive amount of work on. And it pretty much burned at extreme high severity for an area of about 50 miles, leaving no trees in that area. And then also it's kind of notable that not only are the fires themselves very different, but how humans respond to and treat the areas that have burned is very different. And so these two pictures, this is also Ackerson Meadow. I kind of have a lot of example pictures from Ackerson Meadow because I've done a lot of research kind of focused in this area. So on the left is the part managed by the Forest Service and Yosemite National Park now, that was burned by the Rimfire, and that was left untouched. And then on the right is an area that was on private land, and that area immediately after the fire was logged. And so you can see that you end up with a very different result. So here I am talking about how good wildfires are, and you know, it creates all this habitat and new opportunities. But the thing is, climate is changing wildlife or wildfire dynamics a lot. And so kind of as an example here, I just made this graph today from data on Wikipedia that's recent as of today. And it is the 20 largest recorded wildfires in California's history. And as you can see, last year's August complex is topping the charts right now, but the Dixie Fire, which is burning right now up in the Plumas National Forest and the surrounding area, is creeping up there, and it is still burning. And you can see the Caldor Fire is up there as one of the largest fires there in red. That's the one at South Lake Tahoe that has really been endangering a lot of people in that region. But yeah, so red is fires that are still burning right now. Yellow are fires that burned last year. Blue is fires that burned in the last 5 years, and then purple are all the fires that 5 years or more. And so notably, kind of there in the middle, Santiago Canyon, that's the oldest fire that's in this list, and it was 1889. But then the rest of them are actually within the last 20 years, notably. And I have an arrow there at the Rimfire because that's where a lot of the research I'm going to be talking about is located in. And it's worth noting that that was the largest wildfire in the Sierra Nevada at the time in 2013 when it burned. And you can see that that is very much no longer the case. Yeah, Santiago Canyon was down by San Diego, so not in the Sierra Nevada region, but yeah, the Rimfire was the second largest fire that California has been recorded at the time that it burned, and it has been outstriped many times since then. And so climate change is changing the wildfire dynamics. They're not only bigger and more intense, but they're also more frequent. And so what you're seeing is things like this is a paired photo. They were taken at the exact same location One was after the Chips Fire, which, as you can see, was a very intense fire and burned a lot of the overstory, but regeneration was starting to happen. Some buds from some of the oaks were starting to come back, and then very shortly thereafter, the story fire took place, and you can see that very little is left. None of the, oak remnants were able to regenerate within the short term for sure. And so between being very intense and very frequent, you end up with situations like this, and it's happening more and more. So the question in all our minds, amongst us researchers interested in this kind of thing, amongst the Forest Service, the Park Service, and now I think people in general, is how is wildlife responding to this changing fire regime? And so I'm going to start with our fire specialist. This is a species that loves forest fires. So this is the Blackbacked Woodpecker. They have a mostly boreal distribution, but it has a little population that goes down into California. And that California population is the population that really, really is connected to forest fires. You rarely will find a blackback woodpecker outside of a forest fire area in California. So we have our little special population of blackback woodpeckers here. And the reason you see them associated with burned forests so much is, for one, burned trees are the perfect place to build a nest. So there's our little blackback woodpecker working on its nest. And then it's the perfect place to have chicks, because in these burned forest where there's a lot of dead trees, it's very easy for the adults to be vigilant and watch over the nest site. And it's the perfect place to find their favorite foods, which are woodboring and barkboring beetles that live either directly underneath the bark or within the wood of burned trees. And these beetles specialize on the dead and dying trees from the fire. And these beetles are not only eat this food, but they're actually designed to look for fires to find the food. These beetles will arrive at fire areas before the fire has even stopped burning, because they use some high-tech gear that is essentially the exact same high-tech gear that us humans are using right now, which is air quality detection. They are able to sense particles from the fire with their antenna, and then infrared heat sensors, which are able to detect the hot spots coming from the fire. And so that's exactly what us humans are doing to track fires. One, I'm sure you guys have been watching air quality on Purple Air, Air Now or something, if you're out in the Sierra region. And yeah, the infrared and heat sensors, that's how the fire areas are tracked by professionals to make these fire perimeters and plan a lot of the firefighting techniques. So we're having more and bigger fires than ever. That's obviously very bad for humans, but is it at least good news for woodpeckers? Are we getting, at least that sort of, is there a silver lining here when it comes to the woodpeckers? So me and colleagues at the Institute for Bird Populations, we went to the Rimfire and the Kingfire, which at the time were two of the biggest and most intense fires in Sierra Nevada's history, to find out more about this. And so here's just kind of an example of what the, on the left there, that's a picture of the Kingfire to give you an example of how, intensely this burned, that there's very little left standing. And then those maps on the right, those red areas on the map represent places within the fire perimeter where there was no canopy cover that remained from trees. That essentially meant more or less total tree mortality. And so here, just as kind of a reminder, there's the Rimfire. It was our flagship fire and a huge deal at the time, and now, you know, not so much. And so we're starting to do work within the Dixie Fire area, and we're going to be doing work within the August Complex Fire area soon, but that's still pending, you know, since the Dixie Fire is still burning. So here's some little silly back of the envelope calculations for you about this, and I noticed there's a typo here. But okay, so woodpeckers love these fires. They are found within heavily burned areas where the canopy is gone, and we, you know, we happen to know about blackbacked woodpeckers from other studies tracking them and watching what they do. They like to have about 225 acres for a territory, give or take, on average, 225. And so back of the envelope, the Rimfire, it burned about 260,000 acres. The Kingfire burned almost 100,000 acres. So in theory, we should be finding over 1,000 woodpeckers in the Rimfire, about 430 woodpeckers in the Kingfire, ballpark. But we found, after intense surveys in which we actively covered in a grid every portion of these fires, we found a total of 3 woodpecker territories in the Rimfire and 16 in the Kingfire. So for an animal that loves fires, that arrives immediately after fires burn, why would there be so few? And so to answer that question, we went to some of the fires that do have a lot of woodpeckers, that have really high densities of woodpeckers, often higher than that average, you know, density that we estimated above. And so that includes this Moonlight, Wheeler, Chips, Peterson Bald, and Sugarloaf fires that are spread around the northern edges of the Sierras. And it's kind of worth noting, I have kind of the maps over here on the side. You can even see from just these little maps that the characteristics of these fires are very different. Here on the bottom map, that's the King Fire, where we were not finding woodpeckers pretty much at all. And you can see that is all red up in the northern part with total tree mortality. Whereas that fire above, it's got a lot of areas of that dark red with tree mortality, but there's also quite a lot of areas that are in the green where the trees largely survived. So to, you know, answer questions about what are these woodpeckers looking for within the burnt forest? What about the burnt forest they like? You know, what is different about the burnt forest they like? And so to answer this question, we used some radio telemetry and tracked 41 adult woodpeckers to see what things within the fire they liked, what they were using, what kind of trees they were interested in. So 41 adults and 27 newly flying fledgling woodpeckers, right as they were leaving the nest, to see what they liked in the fire. And this picture kind of illustrates the challenges to getting radio transmitters onto a fledgling woodpecker. In case you've ever wondered how you would do that, you cannot lean a ladder on a dead tree like that. But so the woodpeckers, what you have to do is when you find a nest, you have to very carefully watch to determine how old the baby woodpeckers are. And you have to find the perfect window of time where they are full-sized and able to have the transmitter, and you know that they're not going to grow anymore such that the transmitter won't fit right, but before they're ready to fly, so you don't just climb up there and scare them out of their nest. And so a lot of work went into identifying those places where there are fledglings that could safely be followed. And then just a little primer on radio telemetry. I think people have a pretty good idea of how it works, but the little transmitters are fixed either as a little backpack, or in the case actually of our woodpeckers, they were attached to the central tail feather. But all it is, it's a little beacon that pulses once every second or so at a specific radio frequency. And what you do is you tune your little radio to exactly the radio frequency each of your birds has on its little backpack. You take your antenna and you walk around, and as you hear a louder beep from the radio transmitter, that means you're getting closer and you're facing the right way. So it's a bit of just a complex game of you're getting hotter, you're getting colder to find where the birds are. And so lots of crews, pretty much we'd go out in the morning and have a list of the woodpeckers we want to know what they're doing, and we'd go and attempt to find each one and then spend time observing what they were doing, what resources they were using, what part of the forest they were in, and what kind of trees, they were associated with. And here's kind of the interesting finding we had ultimately. On the left is a map that shows where we were finding adult birds, and the yellow in these maps represents areas where the trees were mostly or entirely dead. And then the gradient to green is areas where the trees remained alive. And so pretty much what you see is that all these adult woodpeckers are spending their time in these yellow areas, their time in the places where the trees have been totally burned. And that makes sense. That's where they're finding their food. That's where their nest sites are. But on the right, those fledgling birds, the young birds, they're spending all of their time in the green parts of the forest. And it's notable, you'll see the fledglings are on the edges of the green side and the adults are on the edges of the yellow side because they're kind of meeting halfway through. But so why are the adult woodpeckers and the young woodpeckers using totally different resources? And the answer is that fledgling birds, their job is not to be hunting for themselves. When they first leave the nest, their parents are still watching out for them. Their parents are bringing them food regularly. So what the young birds need to do is they need to spend time learning to fly, getting in condition to do that, and avoiding predators. So they need to find a safe place to hide, and their parents can do the hard work of looking for food. Because young birds are not yet very good at being vigilant. They're not good at, flying very strongly and avoiding predators. And so that's the main cause of death this is true of, or during the time that a bird is a fledgling, that first several weeks when they leave the nest, that's the most dangerous part of their life by far. The mortality rate for almost all different kinds of birds can be 50% or more just in that first few weeks. It's a hard few weeks, and so what they need is a safe place to avoid predators, to make it through those first 3 weeks, and that safe place is live trees. It's harder to be caught in the live trees where it's dense canopy. So here's our then word of the day: pyrodiversity. That means an area with a large and complex area of different levels of burned forest and a mosaic of burned and unburned. That is the key for the woodpeckers. If all you had were adult woodpeckers, then these huge areas of fire would be absolutely great. But if you need to raise a family, that's not going to be enough. And so then we also studied beetles at these fires throughout California, because that's woodpecker food, to see what kind of beetles the woodpeckers were finding and how things were changing relating to that. And what we found is most of these fires that had a lot of woodpeckers had lots of Woodborne beetles and lots of bark beetles. On the left, you can see a forest there. I think that one's the Moonlight Fire. And you see all this evidence of beetle activity with the bark sloughing off. And on the right, that's that King Fire with that huge area of really heavily burned with, so that's the King Fire. And you can see that there just isn't much evidence of beetle activity in this picture, and that's just what we're finding doing these surveys. And so pretty much, yeah, I forgot to mention, this is how you survey beetles. There's two ways. You can cut a little section out of the tree so you can see the trails that the beetles leave behind, and you can count how many, you can get an estimate of how many beetles there are based on the activity under there. And then you can also catch adults with different kinds of little traps. But anyways, why so few beetles? And we haven't quite pinned this one down, but we think one of the reasons is because a lot of these really large fires are starting to burn later in the season. You guys, yeah, it's almost hard to remember this now, but actually in the Sierra Nevada, fires historically were starting mid-summer. And, you know, smaller fires starting midsummer with less of them, the ignition source happening later in the season. But all these big fires lately, ignition and the fire's been burning later in the season, which is after the bark and wood-boring beetles' usual breeding season. So by the time these fires are burning, the beetles are actually not actively laying eggs by then. So there's just fewer beetles to colonize these locations. And, you know, woodpeckers want to move into new fires right away, and they're going to skip fires that don't have food readily available. And, you know, so here's our question: is the new fire regime at least good for a fire specialist? And the answer is not really, not if the system is out of balance. Fires are becoming too homogeneous. It's too large of areas that are totally burned and they're too late. So that's our example of what's going on with an animal that loves fires. So what's going on with species that don't get associated with wildfires, that aren't specialized for living in fire areas? And so in comes everyone's, you know, favorite little owl here, the California spotted owl, which is restricted primarily to the Sierra Nevada and parts of Southern California. And then there's the northern spotted owl, that's the population that's considered endangered, and the Mexican spotted owl, which is sort of scattered all over the Southwest and into Mexico. And also we're going to touch on then the great gray owl, which is another forest owl associated with Sierra Nevada. And I feel like it's notable to have this comparison with the great gray owl and the woodpecker, because the great gray owl, just like the woodpecker, has this boreal distribution, except the unique little population that's in California as well. So just, you know, a little background on biology of these species. Spotted owls are well known to live in areas where there is a high tree density of old growth trees and high canopy cover. And that's because these dense forests provide the perfect food sources for them. They primarily feed on wood rats and flying squirrels, and also it works well for their particular hunting strategy, which involves mostly sitting and waiting and then fluttering down, you know, very quickly and silently from directly above. And so not a lot of animals are really that good at hunting in such densely forested areas. It's a difficult place to fly, but the spotted owls excel at it. And then great gray owls, they live in a totally different sort of habitat within the Sierra environment. They like wet montane meadows surrounded by the dense forest. And that's because their favorite foods are pocket gophers and things like chipmunks that are, you know, feeding in this open area and making trails. And then the kind of meadow areas are nice because it actually creates a lot of snags and dead trees, as some of the meadows, they will occasionally flood which will kill and weaken trees right at the edge of the meadow. So they have perfect dead trees to nest on top of, adjacent to a great food source. So what happens when these habitats burn, when our dense forests burn or our meadows burn? And so to answer that, biologists with IVP and our collaborators at the Park and the Forest Service, we went out once again to search for birds. We went to search for owls, specifically within the Rimfire. And as you can see from that picture on the right there, we did indeed find spotted owls in these burned areas. Yeah, so here's two pictures. The one on the left, great gray owl by me. The one on the right is a spotted owl. Both of these are within the Rimfire area, and both, as you can see, are happily spending time within pretty significantly areas of burned forest. And the thing is, we found just as many, this map here is an example of what we found with the spotted owls. We found just as many spotted owls within the area of the Rimfire after the fire burned as there were before the fire burned. Essentially, yeah, so the green dots, that's where owl territory centers were prior to the Rimfire burning, and blue dots are where owl territories were after the fire burned, and it's the same overall number. A lot of the nests and territories moved a little bit, but there was not a decline in owl numbers in that area. And found pretty much the same thing with the great gray owls. It's this is a slightly different way of thinking about how many birds remained. What it is proportion of occupied meadows. Great gray owls, they only live in these meadows, and there's a pretty limited number of these meadows in the Sierra Nevada, and they're being actively surveyed for things like great gray owls regularly. So out of the meadows that were being surveyed, we kind of looked at how many of the meadows that were being surveyed within the area in the Rimfire, what percent had great gray owls, and then outside of that area, what percent had great gray owls. And as you can see, those numbers are pretty much, you know, equal all these years prior to the fire. The percentage of the meadows occupied hovers around 60% of them at any given time prior to the fire. And then I don't quite know why, but right there after the fire, that's represented by that red dotted line, the number of owls actually appears to be going up. That's, though, apparently not related to the fire because they're going up both outside of the fire and inside of the fire. But apparently, even though the Rimfire burned intensely, it burned hot, the owls are still present. And not only are they still there, but both of the species nested and had young. So here's some cute baby spotted owl pictures for everyone to enjoy. And I should really do a shout out specifically to Paul Bannock. He's a photographer that does a lot of work in Yosemite. And he shared these pictures with me to use. And then Mike McDonald is kind of the owl expert at Yosemite National Park and knows more about spotted owls than probably anyone else out there. And so then here's some baby great gray owls that are in the Rimfire too. I don't remember who took these pictures. I think these might also be Paul Bannock's. So, all right, the owls survived the fire. They're still there. There's still baby owls. Is it time to celebrate for our owls? And before the party, we also wanted to take a closer look at the habitat the spotted owls in Yosemite were using. And what we did is we looked at, the first thing we looked at was, you know, what was the severity of the burn that the owls were using? And so the metric I'm using here, it's RDNBR, which is the relative normalized burn ratio. So that's a relative scale, but something greater than 1,000, that's a really highly burned area, almost all mortality. Anything low that's below 100 is pretty much the canopy cover and the trees are intact. So we looked at that. We looked at canopy percent cover before and after the fire. So not just the change in canopy, but like just how much canopy there was in the first place. And then NDVI, which is a normalized differentiated vegetation index. It's essentially how green the landscape is. It's taken from satellite data and the places where there's a large reflectance of not just green parts of the spectrum, but also the near infrared parts of the spectrum indicative of plant growth. So, so we looked at all of these things, and so was the canopy cover and the change in canopy cover and the burn severity, the owls were still in the fire, but were they only in certain parts of the fire? And what we found is that on average, an owl territory, which is about 7-kilometer radius, or not 7-kilometer, which is about 700-meter radius. So that's 1.5 kilometer-ish diameter. You know, if it was a circle, they're not circles, but you know, it's an area approximately that big. But if you took that whole territory that the spotted owl was using and what the average severity of the fire they were in, you'd hit the averages somewhere about in the 400s-ish. If you took that whole area and averaged out exactly, you know, how much heavy burn and low burn, and if you compared that to just a random sample, you know, you throw the same number of darts onto a map and looked at areas that are the same size as the spotted owl territory and summed that up, you see slightly lower, in fact, average amount of burn. The graph makes it look almost like the spotted owls are picking areas that burned more. These two numbers, though, they're not significantly different from a statistical standpoint. The random samples in the spotted owl territories, they're burned at about the same amount. Okay, so the owls are using areas that, you know, look like the rest of the fire. It doesn't seem like they're using areas that are less heavily burned. So is it time to party now for our owls? And yes and no. The owls can live with the fire. They can live in areas where the, you know, overall amount of burn can be pretty sizable, but they have their limits. And what we found is that although the owls could be in areas that had high severity burn in it, if there was too much high severity burn, they would avoid those areas. They would not have territories remaining in areas if more than about 35% of that area that their territory would be is burned at the highest severity. They will leave. They won't remain in areas. They will not apparently make territories in areas where, so they'll make territories in areas that were burned, that were completely burned, that could even kind of on average have a lot of burned area, but not if it is big contiguous areas of high severity burn. And it's worth noting that we do have colleagues that were working in the King Fire, and they found essentially the same thing, that the probability of finding owls within the King Fire in the unburned areas before and after the fire, that stays the same. In the areas that were burned at less than 50% of canopy loss, there are about the same number of owls pre and post fire, but then anywhere with the high severity, that was, you know, a large area of high severity, there were essentially almost no owls in those locations. So, and then I guess it's worth just sort of saying that seems like a pretty similar takeaway to what we were learning about the woodpeckers, that the owls are surviving in these fire areas. They're using areas that are burned, but pyrodiversity is the key, that they're surviving in the burned areas and using areas of high severity burn, but not if it's just huge contiguous areas where the burn is at high severity. So, you know, to answer the question we are asking, is this new fire regime we're seeing, you know, as climate change progresses, is it bad news for a mature forest specialist? And just like the woodpeckers, it really depends on the characteristic of the forest and the characteristics of the fire that matters. So the fire is not necessarily bad for the spotted owl, and even big fires aren't necessarily bad, but it depends a lot on what the fire is like. So warmer and drier conditions means bigger and more frequent fires, larger areas of high severity fire, and these are the kinds of fires these two species are avoiding. And then we know nothing about long-term consequences. Rimfire was in 2013, so this does make it one of the longest, essentially the longest term study about this topic, but 7 years of data is not a very deep time scale or picture to be looking at. There's a lot of questions left unanswered. Kind of one is, are the beetles that woodpeckers like, are they going to start, changing just their breeding season to get later? In situations where there are all these huge fires with big contiguous areas of burn, how far are they willing to go to find good habitat, or does there become a point where it's too far between appropriate parts of the fire for the woodpeckers? And then with the owls, so we know owls are still within these forest fires, but are they going to remain there long term? What about, as time progresses, is it going to change? Will owls born in an area, will they return to that territory in the future? And then kind of the question that's really been on my mind is, are the owls like the woodpeckers? Is it that the adults are doing fine within the fire area for the most part, but what's happening with the babies? Does it put the baby owls at greater risk of predation? Does it reduce their chances of surviving? And then the other thing is, so we're seeing that adult owls are, remaining on these territories. They're still living there. But will young birds ever move into these territories after the adults leave? Owls are known for being having pretty high site fidelity, that they will try to remain in the same area, in the same territory for a long time. So maybe the adults are just staying there because that's where they've always lived, but then babies will never come back for all we know. And then just as a little, side highlight here, this isn't just about birds. IVP actually, the Institute for Bird Populations, we've actually studied bees and bats and plants and ecosystems generally. So here's a little quick preview about fire's effects on bat biodiversity. And what we find is that in areas with frequent fires and high severity fires, what you are finding are things like the Mexican free-tailed bat, which have big wings and a very low frequency echolocation call, which is designed to travel long distances and is very good for navigating in really open areas. And then in areas where fires have not been happening regularly, you're finding smaller bats with faster and higher pitch echolocation, which is really good for navigating through dense trees. And this little diagram of the bats should remind you of this diagram of the birds earlier on, that if you want a large diversity of bats, it means you have to have areas that have very old growth forests mixed in with areas that have recent disturbances in fire severity. And so that's that same thing, the pyrodiversity, that you want areas in forest fire areas to have some areas that are burned a lot and have a lot of succession and new growth, and then other areas where there's relatively little disturbance at all. And then kind of to wrap things up, how can humans help? And one of the biggest and easiest ones is to prevent human-caused wildfires. Because human-caused fires are obviously more frequent. There's just a lot of opportunities for a human-ignited fire to happen, and they're often more severe because they can be ignited at any time. You know, in a natural setting without human intervention, the only time that a fire would be lighting is during a dry lightning storm, which are not, you know, happening all of the time. They're not happening all year round. Then, you know, this is harder for an individual to do, but it's something to kind of advocate for, is to let the natural healthy fires burn, you know, because these natural healthy fires that are burning do create the diverse landscapes, and it prevents fuel from building up that will eventually, under the wrong circumstances, turn into one of these big blow up mega fires. It's also important for managers to allow regrowth of the forest after a fire. It's if you allow the forest to regrow naturally, you're going to get the succession in this dynamic and complex ecosystem. If you log all the dead trees, you pretty much are just creating a situation where all the plants are going to be the same age again, that everything's going to maintain very static through time. And then really the biggest one is fight climate change. This is just a huge portion of what's causing these huge fires in California. It's a complex thing. It does have also, a relationship with how management's been done, but the real driver of these huge fires right now is climate change. And so fighting climate change can take a lot of forms, reducing energy use, advocacy, and yeah, that's a whole nother presentation to do, but I'll leave it here. And then just, again, I want to thank everybody that's made research like this happen to help us understand how these fires work, what can be done. A lot of this work is going on to helping places like the Forest Service and the park decide what to do after the fires and how to manage before fires happen. So thanks to everyone, and the website is there at the bottom if you want to read the original research papers about this. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I think we're going to open it up for questions now. You can go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask a question if you want, or drop it in the chat and I'll read it aloud.
Let's see. I'm still screen sharing, aren't I? I need to stop that.
Hey, Lynn, I just had a question. What do you think about the Dixie Fire? They seem to be letting that one just grow. Is that a natural fire that is right?
So they're not letting that grow. It has been, so I actually am actively this summer, the past 3 years, I've been doing research on spotted owls within the Plumish National Forest, which is now most of that area is burning. But the forest has been doing everything they can to fight this fire, and they've just had terrible luck and terrible conditions when it comes to accessibility to the fire area, really windy conditions that have caused the fire to jump fire lines on multiple locations. So the Cal Fire and the National Forests are doing everything they can, and I know that there are a lot of people out there who have pretty much not slept for 2 months at this point.
I have a question for you. How much can you generalize from your study of the owls, of the bats, to other birds and animals?
So what we have been finding, as we do, we've, started with woodpeckers, we moved on to these owl species, we have that bat one I mentioned, and now we have some studies of plants and pollinators, butterflies and bumblebees, and we're finding the same pattern over and over, that these fires are associated with high diversity of species and healthy ecosystems. When there is a really complex fire with, small areas of high severity burn mixed in with lots of areas where the trees have largely survived, and then in areas where it's just solid high severity burn, there's just a huge drop in species abundance, species richness. So it appears that these trends might be broadly true of all kinds of different species.
And how would you categorize our current fires, like the Caldor and the Dixie? Are they high intensity, high severity?
Yes, so they've been very high. So kind of a bit of a rule of thumb is how fast the fire is moving is indicative of how high the severity is. And, if you've been keeping track of these fires, the Dixie Fire, sometime on Monday, just suddenly had this huge arm, race out, and that's happened several different times. That's usually indicative that fire is burning really hot to be burning that fast. And so there are at least large portions of both of these fires that are pretty high severity. It will be kind of, time will tell what the fire kind of looks like at the end when, people are able to take an assessment of what things look like when everything's done. But yeah, they look like they're pretty high severity fires for the most part, for a large amount of them. All right, I see a hand raise over here. Do we have?
Yes, it's from Karen. Lynn, I just finished the book called Paradise, which was written by Lizzie Johnson, and it was about the Paradise Fire. And after watching a number of documentaries and reading that book, it seems like it's a fire that's very different than the two that you kind of depict. It happened and was over in a few hours, right? That went through the town of Paradise, in 3 or 4 hours, was very high intensity, burned a lot, and yet there's a lot of patches of trees and so on that are left. It really burned a lot of the buildings. It seemed like more than the forest land. Do you have any understanding of that fire, and is that very high intensity, which it was, but very quick, where it's not burning months, it's burning in a few hours? Do you know if that would make a difference?
Yeah, so I have some familiar with that fire because it is within the area that I've been doing spotted owl studies. And so it is true that the part of the fire that burned through Paradise, and actually, yeah, that first slide in my thing that was showing the Paradise Fire, the greater fire complex was the campfire. It was showing a portion of the campfire in Paradise where there are, no more houses there, but there were trees standing. And so the area within the town of Paradise did burn really fast and really hot, which is unique. That this town on the wildland urban interface, just because of conditions, the fire got hold in the town. And you do see in these pictures that the trees have survived because these trees have had millions of years to adapt to an environment with fire that, are, designed to withstand this, have the very thick bark, have, the canopy up high, so fire that burns low does not kill them. But then houses are not, they don't have that benefit that the trees do of millions of years of being, in this relationship with the fire. So it is a very different kind of fire because within Paradise, it was burning through homes and yards, which are just very different than the forest fire. And that campfire, the one that did move through Paradise, did actually burn for a relatively long time within the forest as well. But the really intense and really fast moving part was what was within the town. So yeah, I mean, that one was just a unique situation because of how Paradise is situated relative to the forest. And yeah, it was.
The campfire also seems like it was actually one of the shorter length fires because it started November 8th, and by Thanksgiving, I think it was over or is put out by the end of the month. The end of November, they got some rain that finally ended the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about that, that's still 3 weeks.
Okay,
you know.
that was going to be my next question. What's long and what's short? We're used to having these fires go on for months now, and so a few weeks seems short, which is terrible.
Yeah, right. So I feel like I'm not able to generalize just because I don't think I have a familiarity. Like my research, I spend a lot of times going into the locations of the fires after they happen and seeing, the maps of the high and low severity and the geography of it. But on the temporal level, I feel a little harder to generalize. But the duration these fires are burning recently is greater than is typical. These are fires that are burning a long time. Yeah, for example, the Rimfire, well, I guess the Rimfire burned a pretty long time. So I don't know, but I mean, yeah, the Paradise fire was quick because it was very late season, but fires have not historically lasted months and months and months either. I don't think it's a huge outlier. The King Fire, similarly, that's kind of my other study area fire. I do know that one burned about 3 weeks as well. So not a great answer, but
will the owls and other predators eat burned prey? So does a fire make it like easy cooked meal, or does it make it disgusting?
Well, so that depends a little bit on the species, whether or not they're willing to scavenge. But what's sort of more notable when it comes to the predators is that their prey species are they reproduce fast, and actually the fires create these open areas of dead plant matter and stuff. They actually rodents will do very well immediately after a fire, and it's much easier for predators to find that prey within the open areas. So so that actually is a benefit to the predator, broadly speaking, right after a fire, that there may not be as much canopy cover that they like, and it might be hotter and more open and a little more dangerous when it comes to their predators, but it actually makes it easier for them to hunt.
I have a question. On that note, you said that spotted owls typically like, high, dense canopy cover. And it gives them kind of a niche that other large birds of prey can't access. Do you find that the spotted owls have a lot more competition in areas that are just burned?
Yeah, insightful question, and something that research is kind of actively being done. So I am not specifically presenting on this yet because it's still, we need to still really feel confident about the data, but anecdotally, these fires are creating situations where the barred owl, which is a species very similar to the spotted owl that has been encroaching on spotted owl territory, these fires are giving the barred owls an opportunity to move in to spotted owl territories that they might not otherwise have had. So yes, the spotted owls seem to be surviving, but it also might create competition for their niche as the barred owls start moving in.
I have a question regarding large burned areas with high severity. Have you noticed how far away do you find owls and woodpeckers who are looking for new habitat? Do you tend to look at that?
Yes, so with the woodpeckers, we definitely looked at that somewhat recently. It's a bit of a tricky thing to do, of course, to track how far young birds are moving to find new territory. And so colleagues, though, have continued to track these juvenile woodpeckers that were being tracked in that study to see what resources they were used, to see where they actually end up as they get older. And what that actually takes is to be doing telemetry flights to actually look for these radio frequencies from an airplane, because these birds are moving pretty far. They will move many, many miles. I think some of the birds were tracked over 50 miles away, and the birds that weren't continuously tracked, you know, these birds likely went further and we couldn't find them because we didn't know where to find them with the radio telemetry, even, you know, with searching with the planes. And spotted owls, I know they, you know, will, to look for new habitat, go 20-ish miles on average to be looking for new habitat is regular. They can go a lot further. I mean, they're a big bird that can move very far if they want to. They just don't necessarily do that. But yeah, we do know for sure with the woodpeckers that they will go a pretty long distance to look for new habitat if they have to.
Thank you.
Kathy had an ulterior motive. She wanted to know if the fires would drive any of the owls to her owl boxes that are home.
Ah.
You got it, exactly. But mine are for barn owls, so.
Awesome. Well, if there's no more questions, then I think we will wrap it up here. And thank you, Lynn, so much for that wonderful presentation. It was very, very informative.
Excellent job, Lynn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
very
Lynn.
much.
That was great. Very informative.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Good night, everybody. And this will be made available on a YouTube link. I'll send up a follow-up email tomorrow.
Great,
Thanks so
thank
much,
you.
Alex.
Yep. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks.
You
Bye-bye.
too.